The docking bay at Vareth's Crossing smelled like burnt metal and old oil. And Ethan Cole had stopped noticing that smell a long time ago. It was just part of the job. Just part of living on a station that never fully slept and never fully woke up. He had his toolbox slung over one shoulder and a half-eaten ration bar in his other hand. The cheese-flavored kind that did not actually taste like cheese, but was the cheapest option in the vending block near Bay 7. And he was heading home after a 9-hour shift, fixing a cracked plasma conduit that should have been replaced 3 years ago. Vareth's Crossing was not a glamorous place. It was the kind of station that sat in the middle of a busy trade route and survived because it was useful, not because anyone loved it. Hundreds of ships passed through every single day, carrying passengers and cargo from dozens of different star systems, and most of those passengers wanted nothing more than to refuel, grab a meal, and leave as fast as possible. Ethan had been working here for 4 years. He had come out to the station after his contract on Earth's orbital ring expired, and the pay on Vareth's was better than anything he could find closer to home. He was not unhappy here exactly. He just did not think about it much either way. He was almost at the exit of Bay 9 when he saw her. She was sitting on the floor between two tall cargo containers, her back against the cold metal wall. See, her knees pulled up toward her chest. She wore a dark traveling cloak with the hood pulled low, but the hood had slipped to one side and Ethan could see enough to know she was not human. Her skin was a pale silver color, almost like polished alloy in the dim bay lighting, and the parts of her face he could see looked tight with pain. He stopped walking. He looked around the bay. There were 2 Keth merchants loading crates near the far wall, a maintenance drone humming along the ceiling above, a pair of Velhari dock workers sitting on a crate sharing a meal. Nobody was looking at the woman on the floor. Nobody seemed to notice her at all, or if they did, they had decided that noticing was not their problem. Ethan looked back at her. She had not moved. She was very still. And for a moment he wondered if she was conscious at all. Then he saw her hand shift slightly, pressing against her side, just under the edge of her cloak. And he understood that she was hurt. He walked over to her. He crouched down a few feet away so he was not looming over her. He had learned early in life that crouching was better than standing when someone was scared or in pain. It made him smaller, less threatening. More like a person and less like a problem. "Hey," he said quietly. "Are you hurt?" She looked up at him, and Ethan kept his face calm even though the sight of her eyes startled him. She had 6 of them, arranged in 2 rows of 3, and they were a deep amber color that seemed to catch the light in a way that did not quite make sense. They were focused on him now, sharp and wary, like an animal deciding whether to run. Her lips moved. Sounds came out, but his earpiece translator returned nothing useful, just a soft error chime. Her translator chip was broken, or she did not have one. "Okay," he said, still quiet. "That's fine. We don't need words right now." He set his toolbox down. He reached slowly into the front pocket of his work jacket and pulled out a small first aid kit, the compact kind with the Red Cross symbol that most alien species had learned to associate with human medical intention. He held it up so she could see it clearly, then pointed gently at her side where her hand was pressed. She watched him, did not move away. He took that as permission. He moved closer, carefully, and when he gently pulled back the edge of her cloak, he found a deep cut along her ribcage, the kind of cut that did not come from a fall. The wound was clean-edged and precise, and it made something go cold in the back of his mind. But he pushed that thought aside and focused on what was in front of him. He did not know if his antiseptic spray would work on her biology. He did not know if the wound closure strips would bond properly to skin like hers. He used them anyway because they were, but what he had, and doing something was better than doing nothing. She made a sharp sound when the antiseptic hit the wound. Her hand shot out and gripped his wrist. Not hard enough to hurt, just hard enough to hold. And Ethan stayed completely still and said, I know, almost done," in the same low voice he used to talk to himself when a repair was going badly, when he had the wound covered and the strips in place. She let go of his wrist. He sat back on his heels and looked at her. She was watching him with all 6 of those amber eyes, and her expression was something he could not read at all. He was not even sure what expressions meant on a face shaped like hers. But she did not look afraid anymore. Which felt like progress, He could not leave her here on the floor of Bay 9. The temperature in the bay would drop another 4 degrees in the next 2 hours. The maintenance drones would flag her as unauthorized cargo if she stayed too long. And whoever had given her that wound might still be somewhere on the station. "I have a room," he said. He pointed at himself, then at the exit, then made a small roof shape with his hands. See, feeling slightly ridiculous. "Small? Not great, but warm. You can sleep there tonight." She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at the exit, then back at him. Then she slowly, carefully, got to her feet. He offered his arm for support. She took it after a moment's hesitation, and they walked out of Bay 9 together, the human technician and the silver-skinned stranger, on past the Keth merchants who did not look up and the dock workers who glanced over once and then went back to their meal. Ethan's quarters were small. One room, a narrow cot, a fold-out desk, a heater that worked most of the time. He set up the cot with his spare blanket and gestured for her to lie down. She did, moving slowly and carefully. And within a few minutes, her breathing had evened out into something that sounded like sleep. Ethan sat at his fold-out desk with a cold ration bar and the rest of his shift report to file. The heater clicked and hummed. The station made its usual low background noises. And outside the small porthole window, the stars sat still and quiet the way they always did. He did not think he had done anything remarkable. Someone had needed help and he had helped them. That was all there was to it. He had been raised to believe that was just what you did. He finished his ration bar and started on the shift report. Across the room, under the spare blanket, the stranger's eyes opened slowly in the dark, all 6 of them, and she looked at the back of the human's head for a long, quiet moment. Then she whispered something in her own language, barely a breath, a single word that his translator would not have caught even if it had been running. The word, in her language, meant something very close to worthy. The first thing Sarah did when she woke up was check that she still had her wrist bandage on. She did. The human had wrapped it carefully over the small insignia on her wrist, as if he had understood without being told that it needed to be covered, though of course he could not have known what it was or what it meant. He had simply seen a wound and covered it, the way he seemed to do with everything that was broken in front of him. She lay still for a moment and listened to the room. The human, she had gathered from the small nameplate on his toolbox that his name was Ethan Cole, was asleep at the fold-out desk, his head resting on his arms. His shift report still half finished on the screen in front of him. He had not even made it to his own cot. She watched him sleep for a long moment. This small, quiet creature with no visible armor, no status markings, no weapon that she could detect, who had picked her up off a docking bay floor and given her his only blanket. In the Aurelian court, beings did not do things like that without a reason. There was always a calculation behind every act of generosity, and always a hand extended with something expected in return. She had spent 30 years learning to read those calculations in the faces of ministers and diplomats and allied rulers who smiled at her while quietly counting what they might gain. She could not find a calculation in Ethan Cole's face. She had looked, carefully, with all 6 eyes, and there was nothing there except a person who had seen her hurting and decided to do something about it. It was so strange that it almost frightened her more than the wound had. When Ethan woke up with a stiff neck and keyboard marks on his forearm, he found Sarah sitting upright on the cot, watching him with an expression he still could not decode. He rubbed his face, looked at her, and then said, "Morning." And she tilted her head at him in a way that might have been a greeting, or might have been curiosity, or might have been both. Her translator chip was beyond saving. He had looked at it carefully the night before while she was asleep, turning it over in his fingers, recognizing a model that was at least 6 years old and had taken a hard impact. The circuitry inside was cracked in 4 places. You could not fix cracks like that. You could only replace them. So they talked without talking. Ethan got out his data pad and drew pictures, a cup with steam rising from it, pointing at her, then at himself, asking if she wanted something warm to drink. She pointed at him, which he took to mean yes, or possibly just go ahead. He made 2 mugs of station coffee, which was terrible, and brought one over to her. She smelled it first, then took a small, careful sip. Then looked at the mug with an expression that he was fairly sure meant she did not enjoy it. But she held on to the mug anyway, warming both hands on it, and that seemed to be enough. He drew more pictures over the next hour. A bed to ask if she had slept well, a simple sun shape to ask how she was feeling, not a question mark just to check if she understood him. She pointed at things and tilted her head, and once made a sound he could not interpret, but which seemed like mild impatience, and he found that reassuring because impatience meant she was feeling better. At some point he drew the outline of a human hand, pointed at himself, and then wrote his name on the datapad in large letters. Ethan. She looked at the word for a moment. Then she pointed at herself and said something. 3 syllables. Starting with a sound like the beginning of silver and ending with something his mouth was not shaped to say properly. He tried to say it back. She made a sound he was fairly sure was a laugh. He tried again. She shook her head. He tried a third time, and she held up one hand as if to say that was close enough. And from that point forward he called her Sarah, which was the part of her name his tongue could actually manage. And she did not correct him. On the second day he went out and did not come back for 2 hours. She did not know where he had gone, and she would not let herself feel anything about that. She had been alone in far worse places than a small human quarters with a working heater. But when he returned he had a small package in his hand, which he opened to reveal a translator chip still in its original casing. It a basic model but fully functional. He handed it to her. She looked at it, then looked at him. He pointed at his own ear, mimed fitting something in, then pointed at the chip. She installed it herself quickly and neatly with a practiced motion that made him blink. It clicked into place behind her left ear. There was a moment of calibration silence, then a small startup hum. "Can you understand me now?" he asked. "Yes," she said. Her voice through the translator was lower than he expected. For my biology, but they were effective for my biology, but they were effective enough." "Good enough works for me," he said, and went to put the kettle on again. She spent one more day in his quarters. He did not ask her questions about who she was or where she was going or what had happened to her. He seemed to understand without being told that those eyes were not his questions to ask, or perhaps he simply did not think to ask them. She was not sure which, but the result was the same, and she was grateful for it either way. She tried once to gesture toward the credit scanner on his wall to offer payment, and he shook his head and physically moved her hand back toward her, gently, not unkindly. In the way you might redirect a child who had reached for something they should not have. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "Seriously, don't worry about it." She did not know what to do with that, so she said nothing. On the morning she was ready to leave, he walked her to Bay 9. Neither of them spoke much on the way. The station was busy and loud, and nobody looked at them twice, which was exactly as it should be. At the bay entrance he stopped and held out a small package. She opened it and found a wrapped food bar and a folded piece of paper. On the paper he had written 3 words in large, neat letters, and with the pronunciation spelled out underneath each one in smaller text, "Safe," pronounced like it looks food, rhymes with mood, rest, like the word for what you do when you're tired. "The 3 most useful words I know," he said, "in case the chip ever cuts out." She looked at the paper for a long time, at his handwriting, which was uneven and human and completely ordinary. Then she folded it carefully and placed it inside her cloak, against her chest, where the inner pocket sat close to her body. She did not say goodbye. She did not know how to say it in a way that meant what she wanted it to mean. So she walked to her ship without looking back, because if she looked back, she would have to decide what her face was doing, and she was not ready for that. She would keep the paper. She did not know yet that she would keep it for 5 years. 3 hours after her ship left Bay 9, the station's credit alert system registered a single large transaction. The complete outstanding debt ledger for Bay 9 cleared all at once, down to the last credit. No sender name, no account ID, just a small symbol in the transaction notes, a clean geometric shape like a circle with a line through it at an angle, in gold. Nobody on the station recognized the symbol. Nobody except one person would have thought to connect it to a silver-skinned stranger who had slept on a lumpy cot and held a terrible cup of coffee with both hands because it was warm. And that one person was not looking at the credit board. He was in Bay 7, fixing a coolant valve, eating the cheese-flavored ration bar that still did not taste like cheese, and thinking about nothing in particular. The credit alert was not a small thing. It was the kind of thing that made the chief financial officer of Vareth's Crossing sit up very straight in her chair and read the screen 3 times before she believed what it was telling her, because the number on the screen was not a docking fee or a cargo tax or a routine station payment. It was the complete outstanding debt ledger for Bay 9, cleared in a single transaction, or down to the very last credit. No sender name, no account identifier, just a small symbol left in the transaction notes, a clean geometric shape like a circle with a line through it at an angle, rendered in gold. The chief financial officer stared at it for a long time, then forwarded it to station command and went home and had a very strong drink. Ethan did not hear about the payment until the next morning, or when his supervisor, a large Velhari named Gren with 4 arms and a permanently irritated expression, found him in the middle of replacing a coolant valve in Bay 7 and told him to come to the office immediately. "Did you clear the Bay 9 debt?" Gren said, before the office door had even finished closing. "I make 1,100 credits a month," Ethan said. "So no. Someone cleared it, the whole thing, millions, and the last beings logged in that bay were you and an unregistered traveler with no ID on file. So would you like to explain that?" "Not really," Ethan said, honestly. Gren stared at him, then made the Velhari gesture that roughly translated to, "I am going to pretend this conversation did not happen," and sent him back to work. Days passed. Ethan fixed 3 conduits, a loading arm, and a water recycler, ate his usual terrible vending machine lunches, and tried not to think too hard about the payment or the gold symbol in the transaction notes, which Gren had shown him on a datapad, and which had made something at the back of his mind go very quiet and still, in a way he could not explain. On the morning of the 3rd day, 12 ships came out of FTL on Vareth's outer marker. Not 12 small ships, 12 capital-class vessels, the kind with weapons arrays that outmassed the entire station and engine cores that burned hotter than small suns. They dropped into position around the station in a smooth, unpracticed formation that made it very clear they had done this many times before and knew exactly what they were doing. The station's traffic control team went completely silent for 4 full seconds, which was a very long time in traffic control. Then all 3 officers started talking at once. Every ship in the formation bore the same insignia on its hull. Large, unmistakable, in gold against black, the circle with the angled line. The same symbol that had appeared in the transaction notes 2 days ago. Station command was contacted within minutes. The incoming communication was formal and extremely polished and delivered in a voice that sounded like it had never once said anything it did not mean. It introduced itself as the royal arbiter of the Aurelian sovereignty, speaking on behalf of Her Eternal Majesty Queen Saraveth Aurkal III, sovereign of the 12 fleets, protector of 400 systems, and several other titles that took an additional 40 seconds to recite in full. Station Commander Yael, who had been doing this job for 22 years and believed she had seen most things, sat very still and listened to all of the titles without interrupting. Then she said very carefully, "What can we do for you?" The arbiter said, "We are looking for a human, a maintenance technician, registered to Bay 9. His name is Ethan Cole." They found Ethan in the crew cafeteria in the middle of lunch. He was sitting at his usual table, eating the cheese-flavored ration bar that did not taste like cheese, reading a repair manual on his datapad, completely unbothered by the galaxy around him. When Commander Yael walked in with 2 station officers behind her, and an expression on her face he had never seen before, sitting somewhere between deeply impressed and completely overwhelmed. "Cole," she said, "come with me. Now, please." "Is this about the coolant valve?" he asked. "Because I filed the report this morning." "It is not about the coolant valve," she said. He went with her. They took him to the command deck, which he had been to exactly once before during a safety drill. And standing in the command deck, via holographic projection, he was the tallest being Ethan had ever seen, robed in deep navy and gold, with a face that was angular and serious, and had the look of someone who had spent many years being the most important person in every room they entered. The projection looked at him, scanned him, he realized, and from the faint hum of the sensor array embedded in the holoframe. And then it spoke, "You are Ethan Cole, human. Maintenance technician 4th grade. Assigned to Vareth's Crossing Bay operations. That's me, Ethan said. 3 days ago, you provided shelter and medical assistance to an individual in Bay 9. An unregistered traveler? You spent your own credits to purchase a replacement translator chip for this individual. You asked for nothing in return? Ethan glanced sideways at Commander Yael. She was staring straight ahead at the projection. He looked back. Yeah, he said. She was hurt. It seemed like the right thing to do. The Arbiter was quiet for exactly 2 seconds, which felt, somehow, very significant. The individual you assisted was Queen Saraveth Arkal III, the Arbiter said. Sovereign of the Aurelian sovereignty. She was traveling in secret following an attempt on her life. You were the only being on this station who offered assistance. The command deck was very quiet. Ethan stood there and thought about Sarah sitting on the floor of Bay 9, with her hood slipping and her hand pressed to her side, about the mug of terrible coffee she had held with both hands. Because it was warm. About the way she had looked at his handwriting on that small piece of paper before she put it inside her cloak. Oh, he said. He sat down in the nearest chair. Oh no, Commander. Yael turned to look at him with an expression of visible alarm. Are you all right? I'm just… He stopped. My quarters have a lumpy cot, he said. She slept on a lumpy cot, and the heater makes a clicking sound all night. I never fixed that. The Arbiter looked at him for a moment. I am required to inform you that no being has declined such an invitation previously. Can I change my shirt first? Ethan said. Something around the Arbiter's eyes shifted very slightly. A small movement, and barely there, as if it was quietly recalculating something it had been completely certain about until a moment ago. You have 1 hour, it said. Ethan nodded and went to find a shirt that did not have engine grease on the left sleeve. He did not fully succeed, but he found one that only had a small stain near the right cuff, which he decided was acceptable. He tucked it in, looked at himself in the small mirror above his wash basin, and thought that he looked like exactly what he was, which was a maintenance technician who had bought a shirt for a formal occasion and was not entirely sure he had bought the right one. Then he went back to the command deck and told the Arbiter he was ready. He was not even slightly ready, but he was going anyway, which was, in his experience, usually how things worked out. Drix, his 4-armed co-worker, he caught him in the corridor on the way back and grabbed his arm with 2 of those arms and stared at him. The fleet outside, Drix said. They are here for you? Apparently, Ethan said. Why? I helped someone who needed help, Ethan said. She turned out to be someone important. Drix stared at him. How important? Ethan thought about 12 capital ships sitting outside the station like they owned the space around it. And the voice of the Royal Arbiter reciting 40 seconds of titles, and the gold symbol that had cleared millions of credits without a name attached. Pretty important, he said. I'll be back by dinner. Can you finish the Bay 4 inspection report if I'm not? Drix opened its mouth, then closed it again, then said, in the careful tone of a person choosing not to engage with something they could not understand. I will do the Bay 4 report. Thanks, Ethan said, and walked toward the shuttle bay. The 12 ships outside sat still and patient in the dark, and the gold insignia on their hulls caught the distant starlight and held it there, the way important things always seem to know how to hold the light. The shuttle that took him to the flagship was nicer than any room Ethan had ever lived in. He sat in the passenger seat and tried not to touch anything. The walls were made of some pale material that was not quite metal and not quite stone, and seemed to glow faintly from inside. The seat was shaped to fit a body so perfectly that it felt like it had been made for him specifically. The air smelled clean and faintly sweet, completely unlike the station's recycled air, which always carried a low background note of machine oil and coolant. A junior officer of the Sovereignty sat across from him for the duration of the transit. Young, formal, with the same silver skin as Sarah, but a rounder face and amber eyes that kept flicking toward Ethan like he was something unexpected and not entirely welcome. The officer had clearly been given the job of briefing him on court protocol, which the officer did in a very serious and thorough way. Do not speak first. Do not make direct eye contact with the lower row of the sovereign's eyes. Bow at a 15-degree angle upon entering the throne room. Do not touch the sovereign under any circumstances. Do not address her by her given name. Refer to her only as Your Eternal Majesty, or, if a shorter form is required, I simply Majesty. Ethan listened to all of it carefully and remembered approximately none of it. The flagship was called the Eternal Meridian. He had read the name along the hull as the shuttle docked, and it was so large that the interior corridor they walked him through had a ceiling high enough that he could not clearly see the top of it, and the temperature on one end of the main hall was slightly different from the other end, which meant the ship was big enough to generate its own small climate variations. They passed beings from at least a dozen different species along the way, all of them in formal court dress, all of them turning to look at him as he walked by. Some with open curiosity, some with an expression that sat closer to quiet offense, or as if the sight of a human maintenance technician in a slightly too small formal shirt walking the halls of the Meridian was a personal insult to the concept of dignity and proper order. Ethan kept his eyes forward and his expression neutral. He had worked in many rooms where people looked at him like he did not belong there. A flagship full of beings with longer titles than his entire life. History was not so different. In the end, see from a docking bay full of beings who earned 10 times his salary. The throne room was very large. He registered that first. And very gold. And very quiet in the way that important rooms were quiet. Not because there was no sound, but because every sound that existed in the space seemed aware that it should be careful. Queen Saraveth sat at the far end, on a seat that was not quite a throne and not quite a chair. You elevated slightly on a low platform. She wore formal court robes in deep silver and gold, her pale skin and 6 amber eyes far more striking in this light than they had been in his small quarters. She looked like someone who had been made by people who had thought very seriously about what power was supposed to look like and had gotten everything exactly right. There were at least 40 beings in the room, advisors, guards, court officials standing in neat rows along the walls. All of them turned toward Ethan as he entered. He walked the full length of the room. He looked at her. "Hey," he said. "You look better." 40 beings went absolutely rigid. The silence in the throne room became a different kind of silence, the kind that had weight and texture, the kind that meant something had just happened that nobody had prepared for. The queen looked at him. For a moment, her expression was entirely unreadable, all 6 eyes still and focused, and then, in perfectly calibrated standards, she said, "I do, thanks to you." They met privately after that, in a smaller room off the main hall with only the arbiter present and standing at a careful distance near the door. And Saraveth sat across from Ethan at a low table and spoke to him like a person, without the formal titles or the ceremonial posture, which he suspected was something she did not get to do very often. She explained what had happened in full. She had been traveling in secret, using a false identity and an old translator chip, personally investigating corruption allegations against 3 of her own senior ministers. She had done it herself, without any bodyguards. Yes, because anyone she might have trusted enough to bring along could have been bought by the same people she was investigating. Her ship had been sabotaged before she reached Vareth's crossing, and the wound in her side had come from a section of hull panel that gave way during a pressure failure in the boarding corridor. She had docked in Bay 9 because it was the quietest bay on the station. She had been planning to contact her ship's emergency channel and wait. But she had been more injured than she realized, and she had not made it past the cargo containers. "And then you appeared," she said, "and then I appeared." Ethan agreed. "I have spent 30 years in court," she said. "I have learned to read the calculation behind every act of generosity. I looked for yours. I could not find one." "There wasn't one," he said. "You were hurt and sitting on the floor. It didn't seem complicated." She was quiet for a moment. "It is complicated," she said. "In most of the galaxy, it is very complicated." "Maybe," he said, "but it shouldn't be." She looked at him for a long time after that, long enough that the arbiter by the door shifted its weight very slightly from one foot to the other. Then she said, "I would like to offer you a reward. Name it. A ship, an estate on one of our colony worlds, a title within the sovereignty, a seat on the advisory council, or a fleet commission. Name it, and it is yours." Ethan was quiet. He looked down at the table, at his own hands, which had station grease permanently worked into the creases of the knuckles no matter how carefully he washed them. Then he looked back up at her. "I want to ask you something first," he said. "Can I?" "Yes," she said. How much political weight does the sovereignty carry at the Galactic Council table? She blinked. One row of eyes at a time, which he was beginning to read as surprise. Considerable weight, she said carefully. We hold 3 of the 12 permanent seats. Okay, he said. Then I want a chair. A chair. For humanity. Not a voting seat, not a permanent seat. Just an observer chair at the council table, backed by the full diplomatic protection of the sovereignty. Yeah, so that the larger empires cannot step on us while we are still new to all of this. We don't need power. We just need to not be invisible while we are finding our feet. The room was completely quiet. Saraveth looked at him for a long time. Long enough that he started to genuinely wonder if he had said something wrong, and if the ask was somehow too large or too small or offensive in a way he did not know enough to understand. Then she laughed. It was a real laugh. Not a polite court sound, but a real, full, surprised laugh. And behind them, the Arbiter made a very small movement that was almost certainly a startled half-step backward. You could have asked for a moon, she said, when the laughter had settled. You asked for a future. A moon is not much use to me, Ethan said. I'm a maintenance technician. What would I do with a moon? She shook her head, still with something warm and bright in all 6 eyes. You are a very strange human, Ethan Cole. I've been told, he said. She straightened in her seat, and something in her expression settled into the solid, uncertain look of a person making a decision they are fully committed to. You will have your chair, she said. I will bring the proposal forward within the month. It will take time to move through the council. But it will happen. The sovereignty's backing is not a small thing at that table. I know, he said. Thank you. Don't thank me, she said. I owe you considerably more than a chair. He looked at her for a moment. The most powerful person he had ever met, and probably would ever meet, sitting across a table from him in a room full of gold on a ship the size of a small town. And he thought about a woman with a slipping hood sitting on the floor of Bay 9 in the dark, she pressing her hand to her side, and the way she had held that terrible cup of coffee with both hands because it was warm. We're even, he said. She did not argue with him, but the look in her eyes said she disagreed. And would go on disagreeing for a very long time. Ethan went back to Vareth's Crossing the same day. He did not make a speech. He did not hold a gathering. He did not send a message to anyone back on Earth. Commander Yael met him at the docking point and looked at him with the same overwhelmed expression she had worn when this whole thing started. And he told her that everything was fine and that he would finish the report on the coolant valve by end of shift. She stared at him. You spent 3 hours aboard the flagship of the Aurelian sovereignty. I did, he said, and everything is fine. Everything is fine, he said. Do you want me to file the valve report before or after lunch? She made a sound he could not interpret and walked away. He went back to work. Drix found him in the equipment room at the end of that day. Drix was the kind of person who always wanted to understand things properly, not out of nosiness, but out of genuine and deep philosophical curiosity, which Ethan had always respected even when it was a little exhausting. Tell me what happened, Drix said. I helped someone who needed help, Ethan said, unsorting through a rack of replacement seals without looking up. It turned out she was important. She said thank you. I asked her for something. She said yes. That is the whole story. Drix was quiet for a moment. What did you ask for? A seat at the table for humanity. Drix stared at him, all forearms moving slightly in the way they did when Drix was working through something very difficult. You could have asked for anything. I know. You could have asked for a ship, an estate, no, a title. You could have had. I know, Drix. Enough credits to never work another shift in your life. You could have. I could have had all of that, Ethan said, but I'd still be me, and humanity would still be getting stepped on by every empire that decided we were in the way. The seat matters more than any of that. Hand me that wrench. Drix was quiet for a long moment, then said, very carefully, I do not understand humans. That is okay, Ethan said. We do not fully understand ourselves either. He finished his shift, ate dinner, and went to bed at his usual time. And the station kept moving, the way stations always did. Gone by morning, back to wherever capital ships were gone by morning, back to wherever capital ships went when their work was done. And Vareth's Crossing, settled back into its usual rhythm of refueling and cargo transfers and bad vending machine food and small repairs that should have been large repairs 3 years ago. Life continued. And Ethan Cole continued with it, the same as always, armed with clean enough hands and a toolbox that had seen better days, and a lumpy cot that he still had not fixed. 5 years passed. The Galactic Sovereignty Summit was held on a neutral station 3 times the size of Vareth's Crossing, with architecture that had been designed by a committee of species who had agreed on very little except that the ceilings should be tall. So the ceilings were extraordinarily tall, and the corridors soared. And the windows looked out onto open space in every direction like the station was trying to show the galaxy to itself. 47 empires sent delegations, hundreds of beings in formal dress, representing hundreds of worlds and billions of lives. The most significant gathering of interstellar political power in 2 centuries. The agenda covered trade route access, border negotiations, FTL corridor rights, species protection frameworks, and a dozen other things that would shape the next 50 years of how the galaxy worked. For the first time in the summit's long history, a human sat at the council table. Her name was Ambassador Priya Nath. She was 43 years old, had a background in interstellar law and 2 decades of diplomatic experience, and had been selected by a coalition of Earth's leading governing bodies as the first human representative to attend the summit, under the formal protected observer status granted by the Aurelian sovereignty. She sat at the Great Council table in her formal Earth diplomatic dress, calm and fully prepared, and she had a small card tucked inside her jacket pocket with 3 words written on it in uneven handwriting: safe, food, rest. She had heard the story of how the observer seat had been arranged. She had asked if she might have the words, if the person who wrote them did not mind. The man had said, of course, take them, and that he hoped she would not need them in that way, but that it was good to have them all the same. Ethan was in the viewing gallery. He had been invited, technically, a polite message from the Sovereignty's diplomatic office, entirely optional, no pressure either way. He had thought about it for 2 days and then booked a transit ticket, because he decided that he wanted to see it happen with his own eyes. In the same way that you wanted to see the thing you had worked toward actually come true, even if you were not the one who built it. He stood at the gallery railing in a formal suit that did not quite fit. He had bought it specifically for this occasion, and still managed to get the shoulders slightly wrong. And he watched Ambassador Nath take her seat at the council table below. And something in his chest went very quiet and very warm at the exact same moment he heard footsteps beside him, measured and precise. And then Queen Saraveth was standing next to him at the railing. She wore full court dress but without the formal escort, just herself, and she stood beside him and looked down at the table below without ceremony. On the way an ordinary person might stand beside another ordinary person and look at something they had both had a hand in making. They stood in silence for a moment. "Any regrets?" she said. He shook his head. "You?" "None," she said. Below them, the great doors of the summit chamber opened, and the delegations settled into place. The chairman called the gathering to order in a voice that carried the weight of what this room was. And somewhere in all of that, what Ambassador Priya Nath straightened her notes, looked straight ahead, and was exactly where she was supposed to be. Saraveth turned to leave, then stopped, reached into the fold of her court robe and pressed something into Ethan's hand. He looked down at it. It was a small piece of paper, folded many times, unworn soft at the creases from years of being folded and folded again. He opened it carefully. His own handwriting looked back at him, uneven and ordinary and completely unchanged. 3 words in large letters with the pronunciation written small underneath, on exactly the way he had written them 5 years ago on a fold-out desk in a small room on a station that smelled like machine oil. She had kept it. She had kept it for 5 years. She had carried it across 400 star systems and back, through court sessions and summit preparations, and 5 years of being the most powerful person in most rooms she entered. And she had kept a small folded piece of paper with 3 words on it. Because some things were worth keeping, even when you had everything else. He looked up. But she was already walking toward the summit hall doors, silver and gold and tall and extraordinary, watched by a waiting galaxy that did not know she had once slept on a lumpy cot under a spare blanket, and whispered a word in the dark to the back of a maintenance technician's head. He folded the paper and put it in his jacket pocket against his chest, in the same place she had kept it below him. The first Galactic Sovereignty Summit with a human at the table came fully to order, and the galaxy moved forward, the way it always had, carrying everyone and everything with it. He stayed until the end of the session, watching all of it from the gallery railing. Not because he needed to be seen, but because he had wanted to see it. And when it was over, he went back to his hotel room and ordered a meal from room service that was considerably better than a vending machine ration bar. He slept better that night than he had in years. He had never wanted to change the galaxy. He had only wanted to make sure one person in it felt a little less alone. And as it turned out, in the long arithmetic of the universe, those two things were not so different after all.